Okay, let's start tonight in Psalm 62. We are still talking about ways to nourish your marriage, and we're going to do a little bit of review. Now, I don't want to leave behind folks that are single. Just turn your brain off. Don't need this. Because you can use some of these same principles about ministering to other people here at our church, because here we're a family as well. We're a church family. You can use this even if you're single. So don't just turn your mind off. Focus, if you would, but especially those of you that are married, think about ways that you can apply this to your marriage and use these with your spouse. Let's start with a little bit of review about nourishing our marriage. We've talked about 3 things so far that I gave you. The first thing was to walk with God. If you're going to have a successful marriage, you need to know what it is to walk with God. Now, again, that goes for singles too. Just because you're single doesn't mean you need to walk with God. But often in our marriage, we sort of think that somehow once we get married, you know, we're in it now and we're just headed down the slide and nothing is going to matter. It does matter whether I spend time with God each day, whether I spend time in prayer each day, whether I spend time in His Word, whether I'm meditating on Scripture, whether I'm walking in the Spirit or I'm walking in the flesh. All of those things matter a lot. So number 1 was to walk with God. What was the second one that I mentioned? Maybe someone remembers. Yes, Tammy.
Spend time with your spouse.
Yes, spend time with your spouse. Every once in a while, somebody comes across my path, and are you married? Yes. Where's your husband? Where's your wife? They're in another state. I'm thinking, what? How does that work? God intends for husbands and wives to live together, to spend time, to communicate, to enjoy each other's company. And that's something we have to work at. We'll talk a little bit more about investing in our marriages at the end of tonight's lesson. Third one, really important one, I'll give you a hint, is from Ephesians 4:32. Learn to forgive your spouse. All right, be kind one to another, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. And again, if you're single, there's still people you need to forgive. But somehow, when you have to live with someone, there's a lot of forgiving to do. In fact, one person said a good marriage is made up of 2 good forgivers. Because it's going to happen. Things are going to happen. And you're going to be offended, and you're going to be hurt, and you've got to learn to forgive your spouse. And then I mentioned also to get past whatever failings your spouse has that aren't going to change. Sometimes there's some limitations in our marriage, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. Not going to change. So just getting upset over it again and again and again is not going to help you. You've got to learn to forgive. Now, last week, I put in an important addendum to that about about forgiving your spouse. Who remembers what I said about forgiving your spouse? Forgiving your spouse does not mean what? Yes, Neva?
Enduring abuse.
Yeah, enduring abuse. Don't let your spouse say, well, if you forgive me, you just got to keep, being beat up. No, that's not true. If you have abuse in your marriage, if you have abuse in your family, you still have to forgive because forgiveness is commanded by God. But you also need to go to the church leadership and get some help. It may be under certain conditions, if someone's breaking the law, you'll need to call the police and ask the police for help. I am not saying, when I ask you to learn to forgive your spouse, I'm not saying, let them do whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm not saying that. But even if they've broken the law, you still have to find a way to forgive them because God commands that. So that was that one. Let me go on to the 4th one here. And I don't have my slides tonight, but you can imagine here. The 4th one is recognize your unreasonable expectations of your spouse and give those to God. Learn to recognize your unreasonable expectations of your spouse and give those unreasonable expectations to God. I mentioned Psalm 62:5. I'll read it to you. Psalm 62:5 says, my soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him. My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him. And Psalm 73, verse 25, whom have I in heaven but Thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside Thee. We need to keep in mind that our mate, our spouse, is not going to meet every expectation we have. A big reason why spouses end up angry at each other, frustrated with each other, is because they bring into marriage unreasonable expectations of how marriage is going to work. That instead of continuing to wait on the Lord, instead of making the Lord their focus, they make their spouse their focus, and your spouse will disappoint you. Why? Your spouse is a human being. That's why. They're not infinite like God is infinite. They're not all wise like God is all wise. They can't control circumstances like God can. So if I put unreasonable expectations on my wife, she will fail me every single time. And if my wife has unreasonable expectations of me, I will fail her every single time. Let me just give you some quick examples, and we won't take a long time to talk about this. Unless someone raises their hand and wants to talk about a detail, I'd be glad to slow down, but I want to get through the rest of my lesson today if I can. Your spouse is not always going to be healthy. When we got married, and then not long after we got married, my wife was expecting our first baby, and she had about 6 months of, well, for her it was evening sickness. She got sick in the evening. Now that was hard for me because I worked during the day. About the time I came home at night, she was getting sick. And it felt to me like my wife was always sick. And then about 6 months in, she was past the sickness, but then you ladies know that's about the time you're huge and you don't feel like going anywhere or doing anything. I said to the Lord, you took my wife away. Right? That's what it felt like. That was an unreasonable expectation that my wife was always going to be healthy. It's unreasonable to expect that your spouse will always be kind. Sometimes your spouse is going to be unkind. Again, because they're a human being. I'm not saying it's okay for them to be unkind. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that sometimes they'll be unkind. Sometimes it's intentional. A lot of times I think it's unintentional. The other day I took my daughter a cup of coffee in the morning. It was time for her to wake up. I was trying to be kind. I took a cup of coffee. I don't remember exactly what I said. I think I said something like, "Here's your coffee." She took that. Dad was upset with her about something. Really, I was not. But you can understand how if I walk into a room, "Hey, here's your coffee," and I walk out. Okay, well, Dad's mad about something. Totally unkind. We have to, sometimes, don't have unreasonable expectations of your spouse. You're not always going to have the money you need. Now, if you're in a family where you've always had the money you needed, please give me some. They're not always going to have the money you need. There's going to be some trade-offs. There's going to be some talk between a husband and a wife. Okay, what is most important to us? Because we don't have enough money to pay for everything. And as I mentioned a couple Sundays ago, the answer is not usually, I wouldn't say never, but not usually to go into debt. Be very wary of that trap. Oh, we'll just go borrow the money. Yes, somebody will loan you the money, but that's not necessarily the best way to handle it. So learn to communicate and recognize you're not always going to have enough money. Your spouse is not always going to look good. I hate to disappoint you. They're not always going to look good. It's interesting. Before you get married, of course, you typically only meet up on scheduled occasions, and of course you're going to make sure you look good before you meet with that person. Of course you're going to look good. And then you get married and you're spending 24 hours a day with each other, and sometimes you just don't look good. It's unreasonable for us to expect our spouse to always look good. So don't have, there's a lot of things we could talk about, but don't have unreasonable expectations of your spouse, and that'll help you. I'm not saying don't expect anything from your spouse, be a pessimist. You know, if you think everything will go wrong, you'll always be happy. No, it's not the type of thing I'm saying. I'm just saying don't have unreasonable expectations that lead you to be frustrated when your spouse is a human being and they do things differently than you expect. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 3 and look at verse 7. And although this is directed towards men primarily, ladies, there's things for you to learn there as well. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. First Peter 3:7. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them. Who's the them there? Wives. Okay, dwell with your wives according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. I want to focus on that phrase, dwell with them according to knowledge. The fifth thing, we talked about walking with God. As the first thing, we talked about spending time with your spouse. Second, learn to forgive. Third, fourth, recognize your own unreasonable expectations. Give those to the Lord. Number 5 now, know or learn. I'm not sure which verb I prefer there, but learn how to love your spouse. Now, the reason I say learn how to love your spouse is because every spouse is different. Every wife is different. Every husband is different. And what works for me may not work for you. Just a couple weeks ago, I was talking about doing kind things for your spouse, and one of the wives in here leaned over to her husband and she said, like bringing flowers. That was not Marisa, because Marisa doesn't want you to bring her flowers. She's told me that. I don't like when you bring me cut flowers, because they just die. So here's my point. If you're married to Marisa like Kurt is, you don't bring flowers home. Okay? You just don't. That isn't the way you express your love to her. And here's my point. Sometimes I've fallen into this trap. I'll meet some fella, some husband who really takes good care of his wife, and I watch what he does very carefully, and I think, okay, I'm going to do that. And I do the same thing for my wife. No response. Why? Because my wife is different than his wife. And I need to dwell with my wife according to knowledge. And he's dwelling with his wife according to knowledge. So there's differences in all of us in learning to love each other. Let's start with the negative here. Know what hurts your spouse and avoid that. Again, different people do different things. Some husbands and wives joke in ways that I find offensive, and I'm not even in the marriage. But they're good with that, and they joke and laugh about things. Okay, I'm happy for you, I guess. Please don't do it around my children. I don't want them to see a bad example. But I mean, certain things I know for me, if I say them, it's going to hurt my wife. Certain things my wife would say, she knows they're going to hurt me. So don't say those things. You say, well, we've got to communicate. Well, yes, we do have to communicate. But remember what Ephesians 4:29 tells us. Let no corrupt communication come out of your mouth. But that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace to the hearers. So I need to learn to communicate with my wife, yes. Tell her if something's bothering me. Tell her if there's something I need her to do differently, or to consider this, or let's talk about that, but not in a hurtful way. And often we'll get into because we are sinners. I'm a sinner. You're a sinner. Because we're sinners, we get into these bad habits of starting conversations with the most hurtful things we can think of. Don't be in the habit of starting your conversations with your spouse with, you always do this wrong. That's a terrible thing to say. You never do this right. I mean, maybe you need to walk away and pray for 5 or 10 minutes and then start the conversation, but you can't start with those things that you know are going to hurt your spouse, is my point. And again, don't just say, well, so-and-so says that to his wife, or so-and-so treats her husband like that, because your spouse is different than that person. And you've got to learn how to dwell with your wife according to knowledge. Now, positively, so don't say negative things. Don't say things that are hurtful. Don't do things that are hurtful. One of the things that I know is important to my wife, for example, when she's making a meal for the family, in the evenings we typically eat together as a family, is for me to communicate very clearly if I am going to be late. So she knows. She's not offended. But if she's making a meal for 6 o'clock, and I know I'm not going to be there till 7, she at least deserves to know that I'm going to be late. Call, text, hey, I'll be late, right? So that's really important to her. I don't need to demean that. I don't need to make fun of that. I need to learn to dwell with my wife according to knowledge. And by the way, if I would just tell her ahead of time, hey, I know I'm not going to be home till 7 o'clock, she'll always wait. You know, it's not that she has to make it at her time. I just have to communicate. Okay, I'm getting far afield here. Let's do the positive side. In learning to dwell with your wife according to knowledge, you need to know how to express your love in ways that they'll appreciate. One thing that I have found helpful, this is not from the Bible, one thing I have found helpful is called The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman. And the reason this is helpful is I've observed that it's very true that most people respond in one of these 5 ways to acts And let me give those 5 to you. Some people respond really well to affirming words. They really appreciate it when their spouse, a husband says to his wife, a wife says to her husband, affirming words, encouraging words. Hey, I like it that you did this. Thank you for doing that. Please do more of this. Affirming words. Some people respond very strongly to physical touch. In my notes it says physical tough. That's terrible. Physical touch. Body language. My family, my parents, and I, my brothers, we're pretty physical touch oriented. So when I see my mom, I invariably give her a hug. When I see my dad, I give him a hug. When I see my brothers, I give them hugs. And then I married my wife, and her family does not express affection that way. That's not a criticism. They just don't. Now, they've learned to put up with me, so I do hug my mother-in-law, occasionally my father-in-law. But it's just different. You know what I'm saying? That's okay. Here's my point. You need to know whether your spouse appreciates physical touch or not. Not everybody does. In fact, I have a daughter who does not really appreciate physical touch. And having to hug her aunts and uncles was a really big deal to her growing up. So you have to know these things. Affirming words, physical touch, gift giving. Maybe you have a spouse that really appreciates gifts. That is not me. I'm not saying don't give me gifts, especially cash. I like cash. When it comes to gift giving, I'm a terrible gift giver. I can't think of what to give to the other person. I've leaned heavily on a couple of you. When it comes time to give gifts, I'll say, hey, what do you think? Okay, let's give them great. Some people really respond well to that. So if that's your spouse, don't break the bank to give gifts all the time. But be thoughtful in bringing home gifts that your spouse, or if you're a wife, preparing gifts that your husband will appreciate. Some people respond to quality time. Some people really want to just spend time with their spouse. And if you're a workaholic, either as a wife and a mother, or as a husband and a father, if you're a workaholic, you can be so busy providing for your family, so busy taking care of your family that you never give time, just quality time to your spouse. And your spouse feels as if you don't love them. Now, you say, but look at all the things I'm doing for them. You're missing the point. Yes, you are pouring your love into doing things for them, and what they want you to pour your love into is just being with them, spending time with them, talking to them, sitting with them. So, affirming words, physical touch, gift giving, quality time, and then acts of service. Doing things that make your spouse's life just a little bit easier. My father-in-law almost always loads the dishwasher after a meal. So we'll go visit them, we'll have a meal together. My mother-in-law sits at the table, continues the conversation while my father-in-law loads the dishwasher. Why does he do that? Because that means a lot to my mother-in-law. And he's learned that, so he does that. Now sometimes I'd rather have him sit at the table and talk to me because, I don't know, my wife and her mother are having small talk and I don't feel like I'm part of the conversation. But what is he trying to do? He's expressing his love for my mother-in-law. So learn what it is in these 5 areas that your spouse appreciates. And again, not every spouse is the same. And oftentimes what you will find in your marriage, you'll often find that you see yourself as investing a lot in the marriage. But your spouse doesn't see you as investing much at all because you're speaking a love language that's different than the love language your spouse understands. It's like me getting up here and I could preach a great sermon in Mongolian. It just go over your head. I have no idea what I said. Right? Guillermo could get up here and teach us a great lesson in Spanish and I would have no idea. Good, bad, I don't know. Right? So you've got to speak the same love language. And again, this verse tells us to dwell with our husbands, to dwell with our wives according to knowledge. By the way, because this is addressed to husbands, men, biblically, we bear more responsibility to make an effort to understand our wives. Now, my wife says, and I think she's probably right, that's because men usually are pretty simple. We're pretty easy to understand. You know, we're either angry or we're happy. That's about it. Women are a lot more complex. Whether that's true or not, the Bible still commands us husbands to dwell with our wives according to knowledge. So, Now that I've mentioned those 5, affirming words, physical touch, gift giving, quality time, and acts of service, could you identify in your own life how you respond? Could you identify which of those 5 love? I don't need you to. This is a rhetorical question, but could you identify which of those 5 are most meaningful to you? It's not always necessarily just one. Sometimes it's 2. Some people may be all 5. I don't know. But for me and my wife, we found that 2 of these really resonate with us more than the other 3. Now, think about that. Hold that in your head. If your spouse is completely unaware of what your love language is, you might find it very helpful to have a conversation with them. Just sit down and say, hey, you know, Pastor was talking about this. Here's the things that you do that really say, I love you. Whatever of those 5 it is. Like I've told my wife, don't worry about gifts. You can give me gifts, that's fine. But somehow that just, I don't know. Communicate that to your spouse. Second question. Do you know what your spouse's love language is? What is it that your spouse really enjoys that you just know every time you do that thing, that act, or bring that gift, or say those words, boy, that your spouse just lights up. So happy. Well, do more of that. See, because often we live selfishly and we want our spouse to respond to our love language because that's what makes us happy. We need to learn what our spouse's love language is. Again, husbands dwelling with our wives according to knowledge, so that we can meet their needs unselfishly. Any questions about that one? Yes?
I found it helpful to know what AJ's love language is, because then I can tell when he's trying to show me that he loves me too. Like, oh, he's doing this, helping out around the house, or he's giving compliments.
Yes.
So okay, he's showing me that he loves me.
That's good. So you're playing 3D chess. I'm still on the two-dimensional board. That's a compliment, by the way. She's right. What she said there was she's learned what her husband's love language is, and then when he does those things, she can identify that he's expressing his love to her, even if it doesn't necessarily match up with the way she would normally receive love in a way that resonates with her. And that's true. Again, I'd never thought about that because you're way ahead of me. But yes, that's true. Yes, AJ.
So Jessica read the 5 love languages.
Yeah, there's a whole book about it, right?
Before we got married. And my mom gave me the book before we got married. So I made a point of reading it.
Oh, good.
And so I was able to recognize certain things.
Yes.
Like, okay, there is a way that I receive love, and there's a way I give love.
Yep.
And if you can figure out how you both receive and give love, that's critical too.
Yes.
It's not just the way you express love towards someone, or you need to know, what both are.
Yes.
So that you can tell the other person, if you do this, I feel as if I'm loved.
Right.
So please do that more often.
Right.
And let me know what I can do for you to show you that I love you. But if you see me doing this, I'm trying to express my love.
Right. Right. So yeah, if you've not read the book, there's a whole book about it. I've not read the book, but I found it very helpful, the 5 love languages. Yes, Tammy?
They also have the 5 love languages for your children.
Oh, really?
And so then you can actually see their love language, and it's kind of neat to see that each kids have different.
Sure. That doesn't surprise me, yeah.
You get to know your kids.
So you've read the book about the 5 love languages of children. Okay, so Tammy was sharing that 5 love languages of children is also a book, probably by Gary Chapman also then, I'm guessing. And if you had children, you might benefit from reading that book and learning how to love your children in a way that they understand. Good, thank you, Tammy. Yes, Christy.
I'm just going to say, I have those books if anybody wants to borrow them.
Oh, there you go. The Lynches have those books. You can borrow them. You don't even have to find them. Thank you, Christy. Good. Okay, last one that we're going to get to tonight. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And again, I'm going to direct this next comment towards spouses, married couples, but it also is true in a church. And I'll try to bring that out. So even if you're single tonight, think about ways you can apply this here at Elmira Baptist Church. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 7 and 8. This, of course, is the chapter about charity. And verse 4 gives us the subject of the sentence, charity suffereth long. Down in verse 7, charity beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. Think about what the Holy Spirit is expressing to us in this passage. Charity beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. The Holy Spirit is telling us that when we truly love somebody, we expect the best of them. We are looking for the best from them. We're not negative, we're not pessimistic about them. Now, that's Bible. Let me step away from the Bible for a second. Sociologists have observed that a marker of a poor marriage is when the spouses start expecting the worst from each other. So the husband comes home late, and the wife assumes that he's out doing no good. Right? The wife doesn't have dinner made when he gets home, and so then he expects his wife's been wasting her time all day. That's not love. And so when my wife does something that is unexpected and maybe even disappoints me, or I do something unexpected and disappoint my wife, the first response isn't, "Why did you do that?" We're going to expect the best from each other. We're going to bear all things. We're going to believe all things. We're going to hope all things. We're going to endure all things. And yes, maybe there needs to be communication. Hey, came home tonight, dinner wasn't ready. Can I help? Is there something that needs to be done? Is there a pressure I didn't anticipate? Have you been sick, right? When you miss church, for example, some of you have me call you or text you, and I usually will text something like this. Hey, is everything okay? Are you ill? Not, where are you, idiot? Why aren't you in church? There could be really good reasons. I'm going to expect, again, as a church family, I'm going to expect the best from you. And so if you do something that's unexpected or I don't know what happened there, I'm going to start by asking questions, assuming that you've got a good reason to do that, and I just need to understand what's going on. Do that with your spouse too. Expect the best. I'm not saying you never need to communicate. I'm not saying you shouldn't ask, hey, husband, why aren't you home on time? But don't start with the thought that there must be a problem and you've got to fix it. I think husbands are typically more prone to this than our wives are. Males are fix-it people, right? And so when there's a problem, we want to jump in and fix it. And that can be a real frustration to our wives. And we don't see it because, here I'm trying to help and you don't even appreciate it. Well, because there isn't anything broken. And we're actually making it worse by trying to fix something that's not broken. When I took driver's training, we had those simulated cars. You know, you didn't actually get behind the wheel at first. And I would turn the wheel, and it would have this light when it didn't think you'd turn the wheel far enough. So I'd turn the wheel, and the light would come on that I hadn't made the turn properly. And I got so frustrated, I just kept turning the wheel further and further until finally the rope broke. Snap! And then I realized the problem was it was telling me I was overturning. And by trying to turn further and further, I just was putting more pressure on the simulator. And I could do that same thing with my family. Figure there's a problem here, I've got to fix it. And there's not a problem, I just haven't talked to my wife about it. And here I am trying to fix something that's not broken. I'm frustrating my wife, I'm frustrating my children. I can do the same thing with my church, right? There's not a problem, but I'm going to fix it anyway. And you guys are all frustrated and wonder, what is Pastor doing? If you just ask us, we'd explain to him what's going on. But because I don't have charity, I no longer bear all things and believe all things and hope all things and endure all things. I've just got to get in there like a bull in the china closet and make things right. Don't do that to your family. Encourage and affirm and expect the best from your spouse. Encourage and affirm and expect the best from your children. Questions? We're going to end it there tonight. And next week we'll pick up with a different topic.